For the last 4 years, Keir Starmer has been in charge of a brutal, inhuman, pitiless political machine. But you simply wouldn't know about that if you read or watched the mainstream British media. 5 years ago, Boris Johnson was elected Prime Minister and no questions asked, even though his election campaign was a pack of lies. Much the same thing has happened with Keir Starmer this time. His brutal authoritarianism, well documented by the way, has been totally ignored by the mainstream British media. And the reason why client journalism is a worry is that Sir Keir Starmer has a lot of serious questions to answer. He tells lies, just like Johnson. He's actually quite authoritarian. He's run a very ugly political machine on his way to power. We need to know about that. Instead of which we get quite a lot of articles making him out to be this sort of valiant, patriotic, good chap who has somehow drifted to the top without really meaning to. Several years ago, Al Jazeera produced an extraordinary film based on the mass leak of documents, the biggest in British history, from inside the Labour Party machine, which revealed a scale of hostility inside Labour to immigrant communities, particular Bangladeshis in East London, Muslims more generally, also contempt for black people, particularly terrible abusive language used about one of the most distinguished of modern Labour Party politicians, Diane Arbet, the first black Labour woman MP. It revealed a right-wing clique inside Labour running the party and targeting vulnerable communities, driving them out of the party, even spying on them. For somebody who cares about democracy, this is very sinister. But that element of Starmer was completely ignored by the mainstream media. My view is that there are deep questions which Starmer should have been asked to answer before he was elected Prime Minister. They simply weren't raised in mainstream debate. What we have seen emerge in the course of this general election campaign and its aftermath is the emergence of a new school of client journalism. Let's unpack client journalism. It's about decorating power, not telling the truth.
I have always found the argument that Jeremy Corbyn is such a prominent local figure that he would be able to mount a strong independent campaign. That has never really chimed with my experience living in the constituency. He certainly wasn't particularly active in the time that I was there.
It's about telling you what they want you to believe, not what actually happened.
Jeremy Corbyn, independent, 24,000.
Boris Johnson, when he was elected by a huge majority 5 years ago, benefited from a whole raft of journalists and newspapers basically determined not to see any fault in the great new leader. I think it would have been much better for Britain and the newspapers concerned if they'd been far more sceptical and given him a hard time. I'm very worried when I'm seeing a new school of client journalists who are going to basically worship Sir Keir Starmer, the great new British Prime Minister. He's much more likely to become a great Prime Minister if he's held to account. And some of the journalism has been, quite frankly, bizarre. Ahead of the election campaign, for instance, The Guardian wrote a piece about Jeremy Corbyn. They reported that the Corbyn team had left a dreadful mess behind in the leader's office in Parliament, and when the Starmer replacements took over, they found sort of revolutionary flags and a mess everywhere and sleeping bags. This is totally untrue. They provided no evidence except an anonymous briefing from inside the Starmer camp. Incredibly, when I put this story to the author of the piece in The Guardian, she simply referred me to the Guardian press office. And when I asked whether the Corbyn team had been approached by the Guardian to give any comment on these anonymous reports from inside the Starmer camp, there was no reply. Now, we had this really serious problem of pro-Boris Johnson journalists producing fake stories which suited the political narrative of Boris Johnson. We're already seeing really worrying signs of a new cult around Starmer, which goes as far as producing completely nonsense stories without apparent foundation, apart from our old friend, the anonymous source. British journalism ought to be much better than that, and we ought to be wary of creating an entirely fictitious character as this brave new leader of the British left. There are all kinds of reasons for admiring Keir Starmer and for welcoming his arrival in Downing Street. He held a proper job outside politics as Director of Public Prosecutions. But I'm worried that the media has not examined his activity as DPP. For instance, those mysterious trips he made to Washington at the time of the Julian Assange arrest and so on. So Keir Starmer's foreign policy is another matter which has never really been properly looked at. We've had a series of warmongering Labour Prime Ministers. Do we really want another? Tony Blair, who was in many ways a prototype of Starmer, was a notorious warmonger, which led to a series of awful disasters. All the signs are that Sir Keir Starmer, with his determination to present himself as sound on defence, is going to be exactly the same. That early conversation, much lauded by the client media, of his conversation with Biden had much that ought to be alarming, because it dealt primarily with matters of war and whether Britain could be trusted to stay with the Biden war machine. I know why Starmer wants to present himself to the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail as tough on defence and with America. A lot of the rest of the British nation, who's lived through the terrible wars of the last 20 years, without exception disastrous, might want more of a radical perspective, a more progressive perspective, a more careful perspective on how Sir Keir Starmer will handle foreign policy. The British press really does need to hold Sir Keir Starmer to account. For the moment, the entire British press has deliberately turned a blind eye to a lot of very troubling issues which surround the Labour leader. For years, the British media failed to hold Boris Johnson to account, and we all paid the most terrible price for that. I hope that the British media does a proper job this time with Sir Keir Starmer. There is a structural failing in the British media, which means it won't report what is actually happening in British politics. That's why Double Down News is so important. And please follow it and join Double Down News on Patreon. And please buy my book, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and the Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism.